This video is titled The Solution and is part of the expansion pack accompanying the original video, How It All Ends. And this hat is my wife's and she wears it seriously. She doesn't think it's a silly hat, though I do. So please don't tell her that I wore it on the internet as one of my silly hats. Thanks. In this video, I'll share 3 different categories of solutions for combating anthropogenic global climate change. First, technical solutions. What physically could we do to address climate change? Second, policy changes. How do we as a society go about implementing these technical solutions? And finally, personal solutions. What do you, personally, the viewer, do differently tomorrow than you did today? You may have already watched the videos How It All Ends, The Mechanics of Global Climate Change, and How It All Ends, Scare Tactics, in which case you probably now see that the technical solution is screamingly simple. If the problem is that we are emitting too much CO2, then the solution is stop doing that. If you have a headache from banging your head against the wall, the simplest solution is to stop banging your head. I hope it's now clear to you what the answer would be to the common objections. If man has changed the climate, then what is it supposed to be now? What's the right climate? Until we have a clue what the norm is, how do we know how much we need to adjust what we're doing? What if taking action makes it worse, or we overshoot and cause an ice age? Well, it's not like we have a giant thermostat hidden somewhere, people, whose dial we get to turn if we could only decide what setting it's supposed to be at. We're not talking climate engineering, no giant space smears. This is a common objection, so I want to be clear. Taking action on climate change means stopping. It means stopping the disturbance we are currently causing. It means stopping rocking the boat. A slightly less charitable, but certainly more vivid analogy would be, stop thrashing like a monkey at the controls of a nuclear power plant. That's the action we're talking about, stopping the thrashing. That's not too wild of a notion. It's not too radical. Now, we're not the bad guy for being the thrashing monkey. We didn't realize we were in a control room. We were just doing our thing. But we're only now just starting to see that there are some buttons and levers that maybe we've been bumping. So now that we know better, the wise thing to do is to get a bit more cautious and a little less careless in our dancing around. To realize that there may be consequences we hadn't thought of and won't like if we continue doing things the way we have. It's going to take some willpower because you got to admit, continuing doing things like we always have is certainly the most convenient thing in the short run, which is maybe part of the reason that there's still so much resistance despite the very clear statements from the very qualified AAAS and NAS. Because there's the hitch. We really like doing things that emit all that CO2. At least in the industrialized countries, it's the carbon-emitting activities that largely make our lives so darn comfortable. And by activities, I don't just mean going mudding on the weekends in your lifted pickup. I essentially mean the modern lifestyle, because a huge chunk of our electricity comes from burning fossil fuels, which, as you'll recall, is the exact opposite of the process that put that carbon in the ground in the first place over the last 300 million years. So on a conceptual level, the technical solution is simple. Stop moving so much bloody carbon from underneath the ground up into the atmosphere, taking 300 million years worth of collected carbon underneath the ground in terms of in the form of oil and coal, and turning it into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the course of 200 years. But, as you might expect, the implementation involves some complexity, which comes from several factors. The first is the simply huge energy requirements created by our large population using current technology to maintain such a high standard of living. The second is oil and coal, made mostly of carbon, are a very easy source of energy. It's pretty much just lying around, chock full of energy. We just dig it up, and since huge amounts of energy are stored in a very stable form, we can safely haul it to wherever we need the energy. And once we're there to extract the energy, we let the carbon combine with the oxygen from the atmosphere, releasing heat, that is, we burn it, and then we use the heat to do something useful for us, like spin a turbine or push a piston. At the end of that, we're left with the waste product of the reaction, CO2. But it's not poisonous, and it's never been a problem, so we just let it vent into the air and let it drift away. In fact, the Competitive Enterprise Institute helpfully ran ads last year reminding us that CO2 is necessary for all plant life. Carbon dioxide, went the tagline. They call it pollution. We call it life. So we dump the waste product into the air and it feeds the plants. No big deal. Well, it didn't used to be a big deal, but we've been doing this so much that the waste bin we've been using, the atmosphere, is starting to fill up. See this bag? It's a 5-pound sack of coal, almost pure carbon, dug up from the ground where it's been stored for some hundreds of millions of years. What's the significance of the 5-pound sack? This is the amount of carbon that you put into the air with every gallon of gasoline you burn. If you're in a Hummer, that'll get you maybe 12 miles. And if you're in a Prius, that'll get you 4 times as far. Of course, the Hummer will totally stomp the Prius flat in the shopping mall parking lot, but we're not talking about that. So the problem is not that we're running out of this stuff. We will in a little bit, but not yet. The problem is that the waste basket from this waste product is starting to back up Not in the sense that we can't put any more CO2 in the air, that we can't fit it in, but in the sense that it's now making a difference in the way the atmosphere, and therefore our weather patterns, behave. So, although the technical solution is, in principle, simple, reduce carbon emissions, the challenge is how do we do that without reducing the activities we like so much? There are three basic strategies in our category of technical solutions. The first is, get the energy from somewhere besides carbon, alternative energies, so that we stop putting the carbon in the air. The second is, reduce energy demand, energy efficiency, so we simply don't need to do this as much. And the third is, do things that actually take carbon back out of the atmosphere. That's called carbon sequestration. And don't worry if it takes you a while to figure out how to pronounce that word. I still screw it up. Sequestration. First, let's look at changing where we get our energy. We currently get almost all of our energy from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. And that's where the problem is, because each of those is pretty much like this, made almost entirely of carbon. So the first strategy is to find different sources for our energy. This is what's meant when you hear the terms renewable energies or alternative energies. Basically, those both refer to anything that's not a fossil fuel, because we want to get our energy from non-carbon-based sources. Get it from your sun, or your wind, or uranium. This can be fun and exciting stuff. Cars that run on water, cool stuff like that. Hydroelectric power, zero carbon emissions. Wind farms, zero carbon. Nuclear power, zero carbon. There's a little problem what to do with the waste, but that now pales in comparison to the problem of global climate destabilization. Electric cars, neck-snapping acceleration, so I've read, and zero carbon if the electricity comes from renewables. These are mature technologies. They just need a leg up. We can use biodiesel and ethanol, both of which come from plants we grow. Use them in their own production, and they're zero carbon. Think of them as stored solar energy. Really, the energy is from the same source as fossil fuels, just fresher. They're composed of carbon taken from the air and stitched together with energy from the sun. They still turn back into CO2 when you burn them, so technically they emit CO2. But the carbon they emit was already in the air just a couple years before, whereas the carbon that fossil fuels emit was last in the air hundreds of millions of years ago. So yes, biodiesel and ethanol do emit carbon when you burn them, but just a year before that, they took that exact same amount of carbon out of the air. So the net carbon emissions of biodiesel and ethanol are zero. It's a really slick trick. Hydrogen fuel cells are a totally cool technology that's just getting started. The core part is often just a membrane. You put hydrogen from your tank on one side of the membrane and oxygen from the air on the other, and hey presto, the thing produces electricity instantly with no moving parts. And guess what the waste product is? What might you get when you combine hydrogen, H, with oxygen, O? H2O, water. So when you run your hydrogen fuel cell car, not only is there no noise, but the only thing coming out of your tailpipe is water. It's actually more pure than what comes out of your tap. You could drink it. Just pipe it right through the window into your cup holder. Try that with your gasoline car. Of course, there are drawbacks to each of those energy sources. That's why they're called alternatives instead of perfects. But before someone tries to kill your buzz about the cool stuff ahead, like pointing out that wind turbines kill birds, and biodiesel isn't really carbon neutral after all because you still use fossil fuels in its production, remember that we're quickly seeing that the alternative to renewable energies, that is business as usual, moving carbon from underground and into the atmosphere, is likely to have a much, much worse downside than all of those renewable energies combined. So delaying action because the alternatives aren't perfect is just a case of not thinking things through. Now, as we look at the second strategy in our technical solutions, energy efficiency, remember, the problem is too much CO2 in the air, and the basic solution is to reduce and eventually stop this process of moving carbon in large amounts from the ground into the air. Great, back to the dark ages, you say. Actually, no, that's only if we're not creative. We just need to change our thinking.